So I wanted to start just by highlighting that actually there's quite a large team of people contributed to this work, and it certainly was a great pleasure to work with every single one of them. I thought I'd put in just a little diagram of the kind of expertise that they had, and as an indication of how many new things I got to learn as a result of working on this project. And actually, it's those sort of middle two projects kinds of expertise that maybe are most critical, as you'll see, computational linguistics and human factors. Anyway, thanks to all these people. I know Sarah Howell is on this call. And if you have some questions about the human factors aspect of this as we go along or at the end, I think that she can answer them. She sort of did a lot of this work I'm going to be describing. Okay, so so I'm going to start off by saying what motivates this work, although this probably will be preaching to the choir, as it were. What approach we took. By the way, I am sharing the right screen, right? You're seeing the presentation view?
Yes, we do.
Yes, okay.
We're on the outside.
I think that maybe the distinctive technical contribution of this is a discourse model of facilitation, and I'll talk about decision support prototype making use of that discourse model. And then I'll end with some summary, and I say future research directions. There's actually a lot of questions about which way this should be going. Okay, so the motivation, once again, I think that this is the motive that we all share. It has to do with the fact that the majority of poor and middle income litigants in North America and elsewhere as well are self-represented in civil and administrative proceedings. And it's pretty well established that pro se parties, they're at a disadvantage relative to parties with attorneys, but they're also a burden for agencies and courts. So, so we're all, I think, engaged in trying to reduce this disparity in ways we can. Now, online dispute resolution certainly has a potential to benefit pro se parties in ways that have been identified by creating a setting in which legal advocacy skills are less vital, by decreasing sort of travel time and the burden of appearing in person. There's a reason to believe that self-represented litigants learn something about the process if they, just from being in an ODR setting, even if later they have to go to court. But anyway, one of my colleagues who might be on this call, Claudia Johnson, has pointed out there is some research showing that in practice, some ODR systems actually are not all that helpful. It sort of depends on the implementation. So it's certainly, it's not a panacea. For a lot of different reasons that are actually outside of the scope of this talk. But in any case, the motivation is that ideally this could be a forum that decreases the, well, improves the access to justice in a lot of ways, and in particular is helpful to people who are self-represented. Now, often ODR requires the participation of some kind of neutral third party. And the model that we're looking at, that third party is a facilitator. I should put in this little footnote. We're not really looking at mediation. There's been a significant amount of work making computational models of mediation. So, you know, like the process of proposing a fair division of marital assets, let's say. Interesting question. But in the context we're looking at, relatively high volume, relatively uniform cases, the facilitators are sort of not in the business of making, proposing solutions, but rather enabling the disputants to do that themselves. So there, not surprisingly, there's kind of a scarcity of facilitators, or, you know, there's a scarcity of volunteers. They're expensive if they're not volunteers. So once again, on the motivational side, if we could model what they do, then such a model could help the facilitators, like by improving their performance of routine tasks and situational awareness and training. And you could imagine also having autonomous facilitation, but the fact is we're not looking at that. We're looking at this first stage because kind of as an initial step, it's just more feasible. So the idea is, it's one thing to help facilitators do their job. It's quite another to actually do their job, which is at the very least future work, certainly not on our radar. Okay, so for this project, our key resource was the collaboration with the Utah State Judiciary. So I had to sort of update the slide a little bit. They have a system that was initially, at the time we got started, it was just in 4 counties, but it's used in small claims court. Indeed, and small claims were required, at least at the time we started this work. Everybody who wanted to file a small claims court had to go through ODR in these 4 counties, and I think it may be true in 20 counties now. In any case, the Utah Judiciary generously shared with us this vital resource of almost 7,000 transcripts of ODR sessions, and plus they made available their volunteer facilitators who met with us a lot. And so this project exists because of that resource. Now, one of the most distinctive things about this project, in my view, is that it combines sort of 2 different kinds of analysis that are kind of interleaved. So one of them is human-centered engineering, and the other is data analysis. And on the human-centered engineering part, there's actually 2 really distinct parts of that. So one of them is an analysis of what it is that the facilitators do. So a cognitive task analysis to understand how they think about their process and what their decisions consist of and what it is that triggers them. So that actually was step 1. The last step was actually the development of a decision support framework. And that was basically at the end, revisiting the facilitators and to say, well, if we could solve some of these, if we could model some of what you do, what would be useful for you and how would you want to interact with it? So these 2 distinct tasks, one involving human-centered engineering, and in between, there's this data analytical activity that's maybe slightly more familiar to us in AI and law. So the idea was to develop a taxonomy of discourse states and actions inside of facilitation based on 2 things. One of them is looking at this corpus, and the other is the cognitive task model. And having developed this taxonomy of states and actions, we essentially annotated our entire corpus based on this model. And then from that, we were able to induce models that could identify what the state was, but more importantly, what the facilitator should do in any given situation. So that's the kind of elevator version of this. What a discourse model of facilitation means is that you have a vocabulary for recognizing what states a negotiation can be in that is rich enough that you can use it to predict actions by facilitators. So actions by this in kind of an abstract sense, that the actions that correspond to specific statements. So let me start with this first part, which is the cognitive task analysis. So as I said, my colleague Sarah Howell, who's on this call, can say a lot more about this. It was a very there were a number of different exercises that were done by that part of the team and not by me. But this is kind of a typical step, is to, after having identified some kind of prototypical scenarios, I guess based on the conversations with the facilitators and the things that's in their manual, kind of mocking up some dialogue. So this is the sort of chat window in the Utah application, and sort of asking people, well, in this situation, what would you put into this slot and why? And sort of repeating that with many different scenarios and with different facilitators. And at the end of this, as a result of this process, we, and by we, I really mean the HCE team, identified some kind of broad categories of discourse states. So these are just kind of coarse divisions of what state the overall negotiation is in, from the kind of the perspective of the facilitator, that is. So there's introductory stuff, there's what happens when people disagree, it's when it's kind of horse trading is the negotiation part, how they work out the final parts of the agreement, what they do when they, how you finish the whole session. There's something called an impasse. So this is a state that can appear in multiple different stages of the negotiation, which is that they're disagreeing and they're not making any progress. That's an important one to identify. There's a lot of social pragmatics, which is, once again, that can kind of occur any place, but it's where it's sort of greasing the skids, it's sort of social niceties, it's the kinds of things that need to get accomplished for people to work together. Now, as a result of all this, we, kind of swinging back to the data analytics side, we developed what I would call a model that links discourse states and speech acts and text. So the idea is that facilitators, they say a lot of different things, but that you can group them together by their intended effect, which is their speech act. So speech act theory, so this was an idea that was suggested by Wittgenstein and sort of invented by J.L. Austin and formalized by John Searles. And it's the idea that the function of language is sometimes to have a propositional content like true or false, but a lot of times it's to do things. It's to change the world. We say, can you reach the salt? And that is a speech act of the type. It's a kind of request. It's an indirect request, and you can't really understand it until you understand this kind of underlying intentionality. So that's the kind of analysis, very natural, very easy to do in this case. And the idea is that each discourse state lends itself to certain kinds of speech acts, and that therefore we're able to develop a taxonomy that link these things. So let me give you an example. So discourse states, as I mentioned, there's things like disagreement, negotiation, agreement. Now within those, we were able to identify certain characteristic speech acts by the facilitators. Like, for example, if there's a disagreement, you might ask the disputants to refocus. Like, well, what common ground do you both share? If you're in the middle of a negotiation, you might want to request the terms. If you appear to have an agreement, you want to make sure you have an agreement, like saying it appears that you've reached an agreement. And now I'm not going to go over these tables, but I just wanted to indicate that we actually enumerated this sort of coarse taxonomy of discourse states and the set of speech acts that was as fine-grained as we could make within the scope of this project. So this is not as fine-grained as it could be. There's something a little arbitrary about exactly what's the granularity of the speech acts that you look at. But we were able to come up with this taxonomy. And how did we validate it? Unfortunately, I think I need probably a slide for that. But in fact, what we did was cross-validation via sort of label prediction. So we would get all the speech acts that occur in our corpus, and we would hold out a random sample. We would train on the remaining ones, and we could see if we could predict the speech act of the ones that were held out. And this is a kind of a test of the degree to which these labels are predictable based on the sentences themselves. So it's a kind of a measure of the internal consistency of these labels. Okay, so let me, so in some sense, that's the kind of discourse and computational linguistics kind of core of this, the thing that's enabling us to do prediction. But I thought I'd pause and make a couple of observations about this. So from a kind of a computational linguistics point of view, something that's kind of interesting was that the disputants and facilitators, they don't have the same kind of speech acts. They can't because facilitators can't make, because what the disputants are doing is something like in this kind of negotiation space. This is not an original thing like in smart contracts, say. You have this model and this kind of like a finite state diagram in which there's different states of negotiation, and speech acts by the facilitators sort of transition you from one state to another. They can do that, but facilitators, the disputants can do that. Facilitators can't. They can't make offers. They can't refuse offers. They can't do anything. They have a completely separate set of speech acts. So maybe that's kind of obvious, but it seems it's kind of interesting. From a modeling standpoint, it means, well, you have to have two models. We focused on the facilitator model, and we used a more off-the-shelf version of the disputants because these things like offering and accepting, these are kind of well-known linguistic phenomena. Anyway, another one, a really, really important one, and that shows the importance of this human factors analysis, is that facilitators, they weren't interested in anything that would substitute for their expert judgment or in predictions. So we thought originally, well, we're going to use machine learning to predict how these things come out. Turns out facilitators, they were not interested in that. And we wouldn't have known. What they were interested in is things that improve situational awareness. And now I might step back for a minute and say, well, why is that so important in this case? Now, I don't know myself how typical the Utah system is. I would guess it's pretty common. So it's asynchronous. So the disputants go online maybe after work, but the facilitators definitely go online after work. So in the evening, they log in and they catch up on their various cases that they're working on. And so from that standpoint, like prioritizing the cases by how pressing the activities are in them is actually pretty important. So they're interested in that. And they're also interested in automation of routine tasks like composing routine messages. And as you might think, wow, that fits in pretty well with our idea of modeling the discourse of that occurs in these negotiations. So we have this big model to predict what sort of things somebody might say. So that there's a nice alignment between that interest and the underlying model. So, by the way, I'm kind of plowing through a lot of stuff. We can revisit any of this, but let me make one more step from the kind of computational linguistics and machine learning stage, is just to say then this facilitation model that we end up with has two parts. It's the representation kind of two things. One is of the discourse states, what can happen in a negotiation, and second, what can a facilitator do? So facilitator actions. And then we can build a predictive model that works like this. It basically monitors the utterances that are going on in a negotiation. From those, it induces discourse features. From those features, it induces the state and the action. And from that action, it then suggests an utterance. So to make this more concrete, if we have a bunch of conversation and then the defendant says, no way I can pay that much, well, that's an utterance. That's one of we actually look at a history of utterances. The discourse features are things like, well, this looks like a rejection. It has a negative sentiment, and there's a bunch of other kinds of features that we induce. Then the discourse state is, well, we're in the middle of negotiation, we're kind of horse trading, and we predict based on all these features that that a facilitator would be likely to make a probing question, like how much can you pay? So that's the model. Come up with a representation based on analysis of the domain and the people who are doing it, and then use that to annotate a corpus and then train a predictive model so that you can predict the kinds of actions, or you can recognize the kinds of states that facilitators say are important to them and that we observe is important to them, and also predict how they would act in those situations. So I hope that makes sense. I think maybe I will kind of not dwell on this too much. What are these predictive discourse features? So this is, once again, this is kind of the computational linguistics part. We calculate the stuff that we can calculate without too much trouble given current technology. Things like, well, of course, we use a semantic vector embedding of the most recent utterance because, you know, that's kind of the state of the art right now. But there's other things, number of turns since the beginning of the negotiation, who was the last person who spoke, the speech act categories by the disputants. As I said, we didn't write this model from scratch, but we sort of reused a lot of existing elements. Sentiment, how long it's been since the start of the negotiations. So basically, without going down any rabbit holes, we calculated the kinds of things that are kind of observable or that we can calculate with existing packages of different kinds. Okay, so I've told you that the basic model itself it's a taxonomy for what goes on in negotiations that was used to annotate an actual corpus, and that we use that to train predictive models. And here, now I'll say something about the accuracy of these predictive models. So one of the things that we evaluated to see whether these models are good enough, which is an indication of, is our whole scheme, does it hold together, should the facilitator do anything or just listen? So for me, the analogy is when your spouse nudges you in the ribs and says, say something. So this is, can we predict that? And you might think that this elbow in the ribs corresponds to a kind of an alert, like, facilitator, you might take a look at this case. Okay, and can we predict that? Well, really pretty well. Weighted F measure, that's kind of a standard measure. MCC is a little more informative since it takes class Q into to account. So this is a little better model of how smart is this model. You know, how well have we solved this problem? This other one, weighted F1, is how often, more or less, are we doing the right thing? So in some cases, if we have class skew, we might actually, if we're comparing models, this one matters. If we want to know whether we're doing a good job, this one often is what we want. Anyway, the second one is this discourse state. Which of these kind of broad categories of the negotiation are we in? The accuracy isn't as high, but it's not bad. Finally, the speech act, like, can we predict what it is the facilitator would do in this taxonomy that we developed? Once again, pretty good. You know, is it good enough? That's a kind of a question for evaluation as a system as a whole. But our assumption is that if we're suggesting text and we're right 80% of the time, that's good enough because the facilitator doesn't have to use it if they don't want to. The question is it save them work 80% of the time? Well, that's good enough, maybe. Okay, so as I promised at the beginning, I was going to describe this human fact, this cognitive task analysis, then the kind of data analytics, and then in the end, a kind of user interface development. So we've reached that stage. We have a working model, computational model. Now, how do we present it in a way that's useful for somebody? So once again, the human factors team had a whole bunch of workshops to offer different features and frameworks and interfaces and get feedbacks and do participatory design and the kinds of things that they're expert in doing. And then the result is that we came up with an initial interface design, which is shown here. I'll show you a couple of screens. So one of them is there's a case queue that shows the cases that are assigned to the facilitator. I think that this is pretty closely reflects the existing. I think it's pretty typical for ODR systems, but it does have some alerts that are somewhat distinctive. So one alert is that I mean, there's an alert panel that says, for example, there's a conflict escalation, meaning that that the sentiment is getting more and more negative in this discussion, and you might want to intervene. Here's another one. It's detecting that things are that one of the parties is not responding, and there's some chance of the default occurring, or the time limit running out. And here's another one, is that there's a suggested response in this certain case. So I'll show you a demo in just a second, but just to give you the basic idea, here's this dashboard that over here, there's a drop-down menu that's labeled with the predicted discourse state. So this is like introduction, and then if you select it, it has a ranked set of speech acts. They're not labeled that way. It's suggested texts, but they correspond to the predicted speech acts. And so these get listed down here. And if the facilitator wants to customize the text, then they are free to do so using a little menu here. I think our demo will show that in just a second. I won't dwell on it because this is another area that is even less my area of expertise, but for the prototype, we developed this sort of event-driven, service-oriented architecture. And the idea is, well, we have an existing ODR system that people are interacting with. We can add in a back end that's doing things like it's observing everything that happens here. The events are detected and stored, and the NLP handler analyzes them, and then it presents this other view to the facilitator, this kind of enhanced view that enables the facilitator to, well, as I said, recognize the alerts, get the suggested text, and then the response then gets sent back to the ODR system. So our demo didn't interact with an existing ODR system. It's just this part. We have actually simulated ODR system. So basically that's sort of tracking through sort of simulated discussions, sort of popping up the text in a kind of simulated timeline to duplicate this process. Okay, so what I would like to do now is just give you a quick demo. And to do that, I will stop sharing this, and I will begin sharing a QuickTime demo that will show you this prototype in action. So once again, this is a prototype that's connected to a simulated ODR system that is based on actual cases in our corpus. Okay, so I will attempt to share the QuickTime player, which I will maximize.
I'm a human-centered engineer on the AIDER project, which stands for Agent-Based Intelligent Dispute Resolution. AIDER augments the dispute resolution process by providing situational awareness and decision support to facilitators. Today, I'll be acting as a facilitator named Monica, who facilitates for online dispute resolution in small claims court. As a facilitator, it's my responsibility to check on the cases assigned to me every day or every other day, and to assist the disputants in these cases in order to achieve a mutually agreeable resolution. So to begin, I've logged onto the AIDER dashboard and see that I have 2 new cases assigned to me. Both cases have a few new messages from the disputants. These notifications provide situational awareness for my assigned cases so that I can prioritize my work as my caseload increases. So both urgent updates and other updates will provide me notifications on the status of each case. Each of these notifications for these cases correspond to a status that is available also in the case queue with a corresponding symbol or icon, which provides the facilitators the ability to gauge the status of a case just at a glance. I can also see how many messages there are that I have not viewed embedded in the quick link for the chat. So One of the notifications here prompts me to check on the case and send a response. So I can quickly access this case by clicking on the hyperlink title of the case of the notification. So here we can see that both the defendant and the petitioner have sent a response. So since both parties have sent an initial message and began chatting, it's an appropriate time for me, the facilitator, to introduce myself. On the right side panel, there's a tool that the facilitator can use to reduce the cognitive load and time it takes to respond in each case. Currently, facilitators have to read the chat and decide the most appropriate response. Some dispute resolution systems provide boilerplate messages to facilitators, which are used to quickly respond to disputants and reduce the risk of typos, and to also standardize messaging across facilitators at the court. So the ADER prototype streamlines this process by using standardized messages in a dropdown of message categories for the facilitator to choose from depending on what stage of the negotiation the case is in. It also improves decision support by embedding suggestions that the system has predicted would be an appropriate next response based on the chat history. The facilitator can pick a message category, which then displays a list of messages that are available within the category. Highly suggested messages are displayed at the top of the list, as you can see here. Selecting one of these options listed in each category will populate the boiler text into the message field. The system will populate the names of the facilitator and the disputants wherever appropriate so that the facilitator doesn't have to. If you do want to edit the message though, or add to it, you can do so here in the message field, or you can just send the message as is. Facilitators need to send an initial introduction as well as a disclosure statement after both disputants have begun talking. I'll select and send that message as well from the list of available system messages, which always provides me the same list of messages every time. Now that I have sent both my introduction and my disclosure statement, I've fully addressed this case and can return to the dashboard. The other case that I've been monitoring also has a message that's available to view. Even though it's only a single message, which means that both parties have not sent an initial message, and so I should probably hold off on my introduction, I would still want to check the case just so that I am aware of what's going on. So I can see here that the defendant has sent a message saying that they don't agree with the claim. And actually, while I was in the chat, I just received a message from Kelly who said that she is arguing with Bill, and it's time actually for me to introduce myself as the facilitator since both of them have began chatting. So since this is progressing quickly, I would want to choose the introduction message that is suggested by the system, but I may also want to tweak this message so that it is fine-tuned to this case or this context. So we can see that Bill and Kelly are escalating their disagreement just a little bit. So I would want to let them know that if either of them feel the need to talk privately with me, that they have the option to do so. So I want to say in this message, either of you wish to speak privately, please let me know and we can chat individually. So let's say that I wanted to save this message so that I can actually use it later in similar contexts when both disputants have sent an initial message, but have begun to maybe argue a little unproductively. So I want to save this as a standardized message. Here you can see that it automatically populates the message type from the dropdown, which is what I would want because this is technically still an introductory message. And here you can see that all of the message text that was available in the message field has been populated. So I can edit it last minute, or if I think that it's sufficient, I can save it. And then you can see here that my saved message is now available in this right side panel anytime that I access introduction and disclosure statements. I've decided to return back to the ADER dashboard to check on the case statuses and read any new message after a couple of days have passed. I can see that there's an urgent update for Bill Serino versus Kelly Ramone. It's stating that there's an escalating conflict that was detected in the chat. The system measures and detects negative sentiment of the conversation in order to alert a facilitator that disputants may be arguing unproductively. This way, facilitators can prioritize cases that might need more assistance over others. As you can see, the plaintiff and defendant are arguing in a manner that isn't necessarily productive. In response to this, the suggested messages in the dropdown allow me to quickly address their frustrations in an attempt to de-escalate the conversation. The system is suggesting that I propose some options for resolution in order to get the conversation back on track. So here I can edit the message to include some of the ideas that I have for them, which may include a payment plan. This way, the disputants can start to reconsider their options and reach an agreeable solution that works for both of them. So I've re-logged on to the AIDR dashboard to check in on my case statuses and if I have any new messages. I can see that I don't have any new messages for the case Nikki Green versus Rent to Own, and that I've been prompted to check on the case because neither party has messaged in the chat for more than 48 hours. Based on how I've handled this case in the past few days, I know that I've sent a settlement agreement for them to review and sign, and that the plaintiff has signed. It seems that the defendant has not signed and also has not sent any messages in the chat, despite my several warnings that I've sent. So the appropriate way to handle this would be to go to my suggested messages dropdown. And since the allotted time for ODR is over, I have to conclude this session. So the system has detected that and suggests that I send this message warning them that I have to conclude the ODR chat and to thank them for participating. I can also send them an additional message noting that the ODR session will be closed and they won't have access to the messages or documents, and instructions for how to access any assigned documents.
Okay, so thank you. So let me return to, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sarah Howell. That is actually the wrong, stop sharing, let me see. Let me go back to my presentation. And attempt to share it. Okay, so I think I think the way I want to wrap up this presentation part is to give you a summary of what I've said now, and then I have a few issues myself that I think might certainly have been suggested in my mind by this work and by the comments that I've gotten from it. So I think, once again, the kind of high-level view is, well, facilitation is some kind of a bottleneck in ODR adoption. And I think that what this project shows is that there's at least some aspects of the behavior of facilitators can be modeled using this multidisciplinary approach that combines human-centered engineering to develop a discourse model of the disputants and facilitators, and then to use machine learning and computational linguistics to analyze a corpus, and then use, once again, sort of human-computer interface to make a tool that presents this in a way that's helpful to facilitators. And one way to, at the very least, this is a kind of existence proof that you can model some facilitation, some constructive facilitator behavior. And I would just like to, I hope that this will support some more research in this area. Okay, but to, as a kind of epilogue, I think that there's a few issues that that this work suggests. So one of them is, well, does this really quantifiably improve the facilitation? As I said, when the facilitators themselves weren't kind of interested in some of the tasks that we thought would be important, like predicting how things are going to turn out. We analyzed what they said they did want, and we use this model to present it. But there's this question, does that increase their efficiency? Does it make things more usable? Does it decrease their error rate? Are they more satisfied? And even more to the point, would that decrease the sort of risk of default by disputants, which is the thing I think we most are interested in? Would it increase satisfaction? Would it speed time to resolution? If, for example, decision support is assisting facilitators in being more prompt or more consistent, or not missing certain kinds of situations that endanger the ability to reach a solution. So I think that that's a big open question, and maybe this bottom question item here, what would be required for an operational evaluation? Well, that's what needs to happen now, is to be able to answer the question in that first bullet is, and so to do that, we need an institutional partner who would be willing to try out this system in a more operational setting. Because as of yet, all our evaluation is in this kind of cross-validation setting based on the transcripts that we have. So that's a big practical issue, and maybe the biggest, in my mind, the biggest questions about this. But here's some other issues. So how do we handle other dialects and languages? So North America is, a multilingual continent, and we have we need at the very least to be able to handle French and Spanish, and really a lot of other languages too. But plus there's also dialects like African American vernacular English. There's in the United States, there's been some research showing that, for example, court reporters don't handle, they systematically misunderstand AAVE. And I think for this, my answer would be that, well, to the extent that you're basing this process on machine learning models, you could retrain them for any language for which you have these kinds of linguistic resources, like semantic vector spaces and parsers and so forth. So I think that there's quite a lot of resources for French and Spanish. I don't know about AAVE. But anyway, that's something that would definitely have to be considered. Some things that we think about, kind of the computational linguistics team is, well, I showed you that we got a certain level of F measure and MCC. Can we do better? Well, yeah, basically, we didn't have the luxury of spending a whole lot of time fine tuning these parameters. There are many, many engineering choices for which, in order to have something to demonstrate at the end of our kind of research period, we just had to choose something. And undoubtedly, we can improve this. Of course, more training data always makes things better. 6,700 transcripts sounds like a lot, but really, there's many, many, many different discourse states. It's a big parameter space, so more data would be good. Something that I really wanted to do, but we didn't really have the resources for, is to dig down into the details of the negotiation. Now, as I've said, we're not doing, this isn't a model of mediation, but nevertheless, it's often the negotiations are quite stereotyped in terms of what it is that people argue about, like, is there a valid underlying obligation? What's the amount? What's the payment schedule? When should it start? Basically, those four things are always discussed, and you could certainly develop a discourse model for negotiating about those things. And that would be, I think, a useful extension of this, but it would take a little more work. let's see, another question is, well, does this discourse-based approach, is it useful anyplace else? Well, I think so. I think I'm actually attempting to sort of move directly from this project to one that's directly eliciting, that's focusing on eliciting facts from self-represented litigants. And I think that's another place where you want to have a discourse-based model. Anyway, that's work in an early stage. So I thank you so much for your kind attention.